Welcome to History 2311. So I want to briefly welcome you by talking about the official name for this course, that is Western civilization, and why we won't be using it. And instead, we'll talk about the making of modern Europe. Now, why is it called Western civilization? This is a name and a term that was used for almost 2 centuries, and that is now in disuse because it is old, antiquated, archaic, offensive, and inappropriate. So why do I say this about this title? Well, first of all, we need to question what the title implies and what it means. First of all, west of what? If you look at a map of what we assume to be Western civilization, that is Europe, you have to ask yourself, what is the center and where is the center? Now here, what we see is that Western is not an absolute and fixed term, but it is a geographical, relational term that in fact reflects a European, especially a Western European perspective on world history. And this very notion of Western civilization as the center was in fact a concept invented by the Greeks that we'll talk about next week. Now, in fact, if we want to locate the origin of what we will talk in quotation marks as Western civilization, it is in the ancient world. And the ancient world is not in Western Europe, around Paris, London, Berlin, Madrid, that we would assume so. In fact, it did not begin in what we think of as the West. It started, in fact, and grew out of the Mediterranean shores, from northern Africa to Persia and West Asian lands. So to study the ancient world is to travel across parts of Africa, Southern Europe, the Middle East, and Asia to India. And to think of borders not as something that always existed, but as something that was invented. So to think differently is in fact thinking about how this links places and people together, how the Mediterranean connects peoples, ideas, patterns, development, organizations, architecture, food, and drink. Now we have to think of it as a Mediterranean world, all around, shaped around the Mediterranean Sea. So the question we will ask is, in fact, how does this Mediterranean world become what we now know as Europe? And that is why I talk about the making of Europe in this class. Now let's turn to the meaning of the word civilization. What does it mean? What does it imply? Now, think about what you assume to think, what comes to mind when you hear the word civilization, and write those little ideas down. Now, that is why we need to be careful about the language we use. And language does not exist in the abstract. It is historically bound and it always changes. So let me tell you a little bit about civilization. Originally, the word civilization derives from the Latin word civitas, which actually means city-state. And that tells you something about how people assumed that civilization was associated with a city-state. So in the old and accepted definition, civilization refers to a people and culture and world that has reached a high degree of cultural, political, and economic development. A high degree of cultural, political, and economic development. What does a high degree mean? Well, concretely, according to this definition, it means that civilization is characterized by the presence of writing, living in cities or urban living, a high degree of division of labor, life in a system with central authority, and social hierarchies. Now let's pause and think about this definition. You always have to ask, what is left out and who is left out, to understand why this term is a problematic one. First of all, what it does is that it maps out a world in which those that do not fit this definition will not be considered civilized. So for cultures and peoples who did not use writing, or writing in the recognized way of associated to what emerges with the Greeks and the Romans, then one is considered uncivilized. Reliance on oral culture, as would happen in many parts of the world, or reliance on different modes of signification, as also would be found in the Americas and in Africas. What happens if you do not live in urban centers, but in rural areas? Then you're not considered civilized. What happens if labor is organized differently in a community? And what happens when hierarchies are in fact changing and can be mapped out differently? So there are many ways in which this definition is a restrictive and an exclusionary one. And in fact, the term Western civilization has over time come to define those who were considered the opposite of civilized, that is, barbarians. And this had meant crafting a series of hierarchical oppositions where one term is positive and the other is negative. So one opposes civilized to the uncivilized, that is the barbarians. And we'll see how that refers to particular kinds of people at a particular time. It means the West is civilized and the East is uncivilized and barbarian. The North is civilized and the South is uncivilized and barbarian. So civilized are always opposed to barbarians and savages, a positive to a negative one. So what we have is, in fact, a definition that centers Europe in exclusionary ways. So as long as you've had groups of people, we see that people have sought to determine the boundaries of their community, the meaning of their identity, and did so by defining themselves against those that they saw as different from themselves, and where essentially they gave meaning to that difference as meaning inferiority and lack of civilization. We will avoid this in this course. Instead, we will examine the emergence and the making of Europe as a process that took place over time through negotiations, exchanges, conflicts, and debates, and often wars and the aftermaths of war. And we will think about how this is the product of a changing set of movement, ideas, and institutions around the Mediterranean world, and how that unfolded in uneven and unexpected ways over centuries. So part of what we'll think about is, what are the foundations of identity and community? How do communities emerge and exercise power over members and others? What does it mean to be a member of or to be excluded from social groups? How do shifting notions of authority impact the boundaries of community? And what is the relationship between religion and the political? These will be the questions that organize our entire semester. I will leave you to fill out a discussion forum, which is an invitation to reflect on what you knew of European history and what you expect to learn this semester. Thank you very much, and welcome to, I hope, an enjoyable and productive semester.